Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, and welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Alright, so today we're going to be covering your Chapter 13 review, The South and Slavery. If you remember correctly, we left you off after Chapter 12, which was the North and Industry, and with this chapter, we reviewed slavery, we reviewed slave codes, the Cotton Belt, Nat Turner's Rebellion, and really the effect that not having industry, not having factories, not having this industrialization or the Industrial Revolution happening in the South, especially the transportation revolution as well, what type of effect does it have in the South? Now you have to remember, we go back to our days of the 13 colonies, right? What were the Southern colonies all about? Our economy was based upon tobacco, rice, and indigo, farming. And who was the one doing the farming in the South? Well, you had some white planters, you had some white farmers, but harvesting the crops in the South, it was the slaves, plain and simple. It was definitely the slaves in the South. When we talk about what was the cause of the Civil War, you can mention a couple of different things, but you're really going to be mentioning slavery as the main cause of the Civil War. We'll discuss that more when we get there. But you have to remember, what was the Southern economy based on? It was based on agriculture. Tobacco was the main crop from 1600 until the 1800s. So we're looking now at a transfer or a revolution from tobacco being the main crop or the main export of the South to cotton. Cotton is now going to be king in the South. The cotton production is decreasing until Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. That's really the big thing which you can compare the North and the South. Eli Whitney invents this cotton gin, this new, faster, cheaper, more efficient way of cleaning the seeds out of cotton. So now the United States, the southern part of the United States, becomes king cotton of the world. You remember that they're selling about 75% of the share of their raw material to Britain. So you have now Britain purchasing so much of our cotton in the South. So now slavery, expands exponentially because more and more farmers are growing cotton, and they're not growing things like tobacco, rice, indigo, sweet potatoes, or corn anymore. So you have to remember now cotton as king cotton or as a cash crop. Remember, you don't eat cash crops. Those are the ones that you sell for cash. You have cotton. It's easily storable. It's easily transported. So it's just made so much more sense in the South to be able to make a lot more money. Remember that when all the farmers kept planting cotton and planting cotton and planting cotton, it really ruined and soiled it in the South, so they had to start doing more and more crop rotations to be able to save the land. And you'll see a brief rise of tobacco production again when, believe it or not, a slave finds a better way to cure the tobacco leaf. The next thing that we talked about in Chapter 13 was the people of the South. What type of people were living in the South? Now, we know that slaves were. Slaves were a huge population in the South. Roughly 1/3 of the whole population in the South were slaves. In the 1860s, late 1850s, early 1860s, there were some states that, believe it or not, the slave population outnumbered the white population. So this is how many slaves we're talking about in the South. But when we talked about it in this chapter, we broke it down to 4 main demographic groups. The planters, the rich, the wealthy planters. They were the guys that owned the huge plantations, hundreds if not thousands of slaves. They were the guys that had the big houses, lived very nice. But remember, they were the smallest part of the population. Then you had the yeoman farmers. These were the guys that had not so big of farms. These were the farmers that, of course, they were white. They had a handful of slaves, maybe, 5 to 50 slaves. And the yeoman farmers were the farmers that went out there and worked side by side with their slaves. And that's pretty important. The planters didn't do that. The planters, they forced their hand in the labor. They were the ones that were really whipping and beating and not caring much about the slaves. They were the guys who had other slaves looking over the majority of the field hands. They did not get their hands dirty. These yeoman farmers, they got their hands dirty. They worked side by side with their slaves. And then you had the poor whites. The poor whites did not have any slaves. They, as a matter of fact, didn't even have any good land to be able to farm on, so that's why they didn't have any slaves. They might have a small farm, or they might raise some small animals, but they would farm on other people's land. So this is what the poor whites, that's how they different than the other whites. So you had those three white demographic right there. You had the planters, the rich, the super wealthy. You had the yeoman farmers, the smaller farm owners who work side by side with their slaves. You had the poor whites. And then, of course, the largest demographic when we're talking like that is we're talking about the slaves, the field hands, the slaves that were working on the field. Now remember, those are the ones that harvested the cotton. But they were not the only type of slave out there. You had what you would call house servants as well. Those would be the butlers, the nurses, the cooks. They would work in the house. You had some slaves that were apprenticed to some white people who were able to learn a skill, blacksmithing, carpentry, and they would be able to sell, like a slave owner would allow the slave to sell their work to somebody else, and they would actually, even though it didn't happen very frequently, but some of these slaves would be able to use this money to purchase their freedom. So why is slavery so prevalent in the South besides the agriculture? Well, you have to also remember that in the South during the 1800s, you have people believing that, religion, it was their Christianity that allowed them to rule over others. You can actually go into a whole deeper story into that, but we're just going to scratch the surface here, really. White planters in the South believed that people were put on this earth to rule over people. Like, they went all the way back even to the Egyptians, right? This is their reason. They could find passages in the Bible that really made it seem that way, that this is why they were able to rule over people. So you have that huge difference between the three different white demographics in the South, and then you have the slaves, of course, in the South. The last thing we're going to come over here is the institution of slavery. Since the beginning of class, we've been talking about how slave owners treat their slaves as property. These slaves would go to slave auctions, and they would get sold off. We described that a little bit in class about what would happen if some slave traders had some poor shipments, what the type of things they would do. You have to remember that they would go out and try to catch some fugitives and bring them back in. I told you that they would do things like color gray hairs. They would hide scars, because if a slave had scars, that means he would rebel against his slave owner. So they would do things to try to make the slaves more appealing. Remember that slaves lived in cabins. Lots of times they were without floors. They might have had a fireplace in there. They might have had a little farm that they could grow some of their own food. But you have to remember that these field hands and the planters looked at them as property, so they didn't really treat them very well. They would often whip them, put them in chains as punishment. They put slave codes on the slaves that prohibited a lot of things like movement and business transaction. But the slaves, they were able to create a slave community. They created a culture, a slave culture, and they would tell folk tales and they would tell stories and sing songs and draw art, and it would be able to help them, cope with the harshness that they were living. They would even do things to try to slow production as like a rebellion. They would, they wouldn't work as hard on the farm during the days if they didn't like their slave owner. And you start having slave rebellions, right? So you have the Nat Turner rebellion. Nat Turner believed he was sent from God to start this rebellion, and he and about 100 other slaves, they were traveling through Virginia, and their goal was to kill all the white slave owners. Ultimately, hundreds of slaves are killed. Nat Turner's caught. He's hung very quickly, and these slave codes really got tightened down on the slaveries in the South. You did have some free black people in the South as well. They were treated very differently, because you have to remember that, if a free black person was walking by a farm that had a full field of, farm hands, slaves in the field, they would not, they would not appreciate a free, black person walking by them. But you have to remember, it's still, even though they were freeing the black in the South, they weren't getting educated. The whites in the South still believed that, they needed to be there to take care of them. So life still wasn't great, and it doesn't wind up being great for a long time for free blacks in the South. But that's just, like I said, to do a whole chapter on the institution of slavery and how it affected the South, you could actually probably talk about that all year. So good luck on your test, and next we're going to get into immigration.